"Someone clean this mess before we sign," Richard Whitmore said without looking up, his voice calm but edged with impatience as the thick stack of contracts slid off the polished mahogany table and scattered across the marble floor like fallen cards. The boardroom fell briefly quiet, not because the papers mattered, but because no one moved. No one wanted to be the one to bend down first in a room where pride weighed more than paper, and then the door opened softly, almost apologetically, as Ava Carter stepped inside with a rolling cleaning cart, the faint scent of lemon disinfectant trailing behind her, her dark uniform simple and pressed, her name badge catching the pale glow of the recessed lighting. She paused for half a second, sensing the tension before anyone spoke, sensing the invisible wall that always existed in rooms like this, where suits cost more than her monthly rent and voices carried the quiet authority of people used to being listened to. She lowered her eyes and began gathering the papers carefully, one by one, her movement steady, practiced, invisible, the way she had learned to move through spaces that were never meant for her. The sound of paper sliding against marble echoed faintly beneath the hum of the ceiling vents, and as she lifted the final contract, her eyes paused, just for a moment, not out of curiosity but instinct, the same instinct that had followed her since childhood, the same instinct that once helped her father catch accounting discrepancies at a small firm before everything collapsed, before hospital bills, before she traded textbooks for cleaning supplies. The clause sat halfway down the page, buried in dense legal language, subtle, almost elegant, and Ava felt something tighten in her chest, the words rearranging themselves in her mind: liability transfer, voting rights dilution, control shift. She blinked once, then again, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper. Across the room a senior executive cleared his throat. Another tapped a silver pen against a tablet. Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, checking his watch, unaware that the cleaner still stood beside the table, the sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows painted long pale lines across the marble floor, stretching toward Ava's shoes. She hesitated, her heart beating faster than it should, faster than a cleaner's heart should beat in a room like this, because cleaners didn't speak, they didn't interrupt, they didn't exist beyond the edges of the room. But the clause sat there, quiet and dangerous, like a loose wire behind a wall, and Ava heard her father's voice in her memory, calm and patient, saying numbers never lie, people just hide them. Her throat tightened, she placed the stack neatly on the table, then before she could stop herself, she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough to travel across the polished silence. "Sir, this isn't a merger," and the room froze, not dramatically, not loudly, just the subtle stillness of a dozen people pausing mid-breath, Whitmore's pen hovering inches above the signature line. Someone shifted in their chair, another blinked, surprised that the voice had come from behind them. Ava swallowed gently, her hand steady now. "It's a controlled transfer. If you sign this, you won't own your company anymore." And the silence deepened, the kind that felt heavy, like air before a storm. Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes for the first time, his gaze landing on Ava as if noticing her existence only now. The cleaner standing beside his chair, holding the contract, her expression calm, respectful, but certain. And for the briefest moment, the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than anything else in the room. Whitmore did not speak immediately, and that silence stretched across the room like a held breath, his silver pen still hovering above the signature line as he studied Ava Carter with a measured, unfamiliar focus, as though he were trying to determine whether she was a distraction or a variable he had overlooked. And Ava felt every pair of eyes turn toward her, some curious, some annoyed, others quietly dismissive. The kind of look she had grown used to, the kind that passed over her like she was part of the furniture. Yet she stood still, hands folded lightly in front of her, her shoulders relaxed but her heartbeat steady and deliberate, because once the words were spoken there was no retreat. Across the polished table one of the younger executives leaned back slightly, whispering something under his breath, while another adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward Whitmore as if waiting for the inevitable dismissal. But Whitmore did not dismiss her, not yet. Instead he leaned forward slowly, his chair gliding softly across the carpet beneath him, and extended his hand toward the contract Ava still held. She placed it gently on the table, careful not to crease the edges, and he flipped to the page she had been reading, his eyes scanning the dense block of legal text, his expression calm, controlled, unreadable, while Ava remained where she stood, the faint scent of cleaning solution still lingering around her cart, the contrast between her quiet presence and the polished authority of the room more visible now than ever. A senior partner cleared his throat again, attempting to restore the rhythm of the meeting, but Whitmore raised one finger slightly without looking up, a small gesture that silenced the interruption instantly. Ava noticed the subtle shift in the room, the way authority moved without volume, the way silence could be commanded with a single motion, and she felt a quiet awareness settle inside her. This was not just a room of executives, it was a room where decisions shaped thousands of jobs, thousands of families, and that realization made her voice earlier feel heavier, more consequential, as Whitmore's gaze moved line by line, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, the sunlight shifting slightly across the table as a cloud passed outside, the brightness dimming for a brief moment, and Ava remembered nights sitting at her kitchen table years ago, her father explaining balance sheets on lined paper, showing her how a single misplaced figure could unravel an entire company. She had not thought about those lessons in years. Not since the hospital bills piled up and textbooks were replaced by overtime shifts, yet now those same instincts guided her. Whitmore finally paused, his finger resting lightly against a paragraph halfway down the page, and he read it again, slower this time. The room remained silent, a quiet tension forming, not dramatic, not loud, just the subtle shift of professionals realizing something might be off. One of the legal advisors leaned slightly forward, trying to read Whitmore's expression, but found nothing. Whitmore then lifted his eyes briefly toward Ava, not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with a sharper curiosity, as though reassessing her presence entirely. And Ava held his gaze calmly, respectful but certain, because she had already crossed the line between invisible and noticed, and there was no returning to the quiet anonymity she had walked in with. Outside the windows the city stretched across several miles of glass and steel, traffic moving far below like silent currents, and inside that boardroom, the quiet between a cleaner and a chief executive officer began to reshape the air itself. The legal advisor seated 2 chairs to Whitmore's right leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses as he reached for a duplicate copy of the contract, his movements careful and deliberate, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder in the controlled stillness of the boardroom. Ava remained beside her cleaning cart, her posture quiet but composed, aware that every second now stretched longer than the last. Whitmore did not look away from the page, his eyes scanning the clause again, slower, more methodical, and the subtle tightening along his jaw became more noticeable. Across the table a senior executive shifted in his seat, his polished shoes crossing neatly as he attempted to restore normalcy with a calm voice, saying that the agreement had already been reviewed by multiple teams. Yet Whitmore did not respond, he simply raised his hand slightly again, the motion small but final, and the executive fell silent immediately. The legal advisor began reading the same paragraph, his brow lowering gradually as he moved through the dense wording. The room grew even quieter, the faint hum of the ceiling vents blending with the distant sound of traffic 27 floors below. Ava felt the weight of the moment settle deeper, her hands lightly resting on the handle of her cart, her eyes lowered respectfully yet attentive. She did not speak again. She did not need to, because the words were already there, printed in black ink, waiting to be understood. The legal advisor turned the page back, then forward again, his finger tracing a line as if confirming what he thought he had seen, and then he leaned closer toward Whitmore, his voice low but audible enough for the room, explaining that the clause did appear to shift controlling interest under specific performance conditions. His tone careful, neutral, professional. But the implication settled heavily across the polished table. One of the investors leaned forward quickly, asking for clarification, and the advisor explained further, noting that if certain benchmarks were not met within the first 18 months, majority voting rights would transfer automatically. Whitmore's expression remained controlled, but the faint tightening around his eyes revealed the shift in his thinking. Ava remembered her father explaining similar clauses, how they were rarely obvious, how they were designed to look harmless until activated. The sunlight brightened again as the cloud passed, illuminating the silver watch on Whitmore's wrist. He tapped the pen once against the contract, then set it down quietly, and that small motion carried more weight than any raised voice. Across the room, another executive reached for his tablet, quickly reviewing the digital version, his expression slowly changing from confidence to uncertainty. The investor beside him leaned in, whispering something, their voices low but tense. Ava remained still, aware that she had stepped into a moment larger than herself, larger than her shift, larger than the quiet routine she had followed every night. Whitmore finally leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving from the contract to Ava once more, and this time there was no dismissal in his eyes, only calculation and a growing recognition that the quiet cleaner standing beside a mop bucket had introduced a possibility no one else had considered, Outside the windows, the city sunlight reflected off neighboring towers, sending brief flashes of brightness across the boardroom walls, and inside that room, the direction of a multimillion-dollar decision began to shift, not through volume or authority, but through a quiet observation spoken by someone no one had expected to hear. Whitmore's fingers rested lightly on the contract as he leaned forward again, the faint reflection of the city skyline gliding across the polished table, and when he finally spoke his voice was calm, measured, but noticeably sharper than before, asking who had drafted the liability structure for the agreement. The question did not sound accusatory, yet it carried enough weight that several executives shifted in their seats. One of the senior partners cleared his throat and explained that the clause originated from the opposing firm's legal team, reviewed internally and approved during late-stage negotiations. Whitmore nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the document, and then he turned one more page, scanning the supporting conditions with the same deliberate patience. Ava remained beside her cart, quiet and still, yet she could feel the temperature of the room subtly changing, confidence dissolving into calculation, certainty giving way to caution. Across the table, an investor leaned closer toward the legal advisor, whispering numbers under his breath, percentages, control thresholds, revenue triggers, the kind of quiet arithmetic that only surfaced when risk entered the conversation. Whitmore lifted the page slightly, angling it toward the light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and his eyes paused again, this time longer, more deliberate. The silence stretched, and then he spoke again, pointing to a subsection near the bottom, asking if the performance benchmarks included board restructuring provisions. The legal advisor leaned forward quickly, reading with growing concern, and then he nodded slowly, explaining that if the transfer condition activated, the incoming firm would gain immediate authority to nominate 3 additional board members, shifting voting power permanently. The room absorbed that detail in silence. One of the executives leaned back slowly, his confidence visibly fading. Another adjusted his tie, glancing toward Whitmore, as if reassessing the momentum of the entire deal. Ava watched quietly, remembering the same pattern her father once described. Control rarely moved in obvious ways, it shifted through conditions, thresholds, quiet mechanisms that only revealed themselves when it was too late. Whitmore placed the contract flat again, his expression calm but his focus sharpened. He reached for his pen, not to sign, but to circle the clause lightly. The faint scratch of ink against paper sounded louder than expected, and then he leaned back, his gaze moving across the room, measuring reactions, reading faces, the authority in his silence now more deliberate. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected off a passing cloud, briefly dimming the brightness inside, and Ava noticed how the executives leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Whitmore finally turned his attention toward Ava again, his eyes no longer dismissive, no longer distant, but assessing, thoughtful, as if recalibrating his understanding of her presence. Entirely, she met his gaze respectfully, her posture unchanged, the quiet cleaner who had entered to gather papers now standing at the center of a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and in that stillness, the sound of the city far below faded into the background, replaced by the quiet realization that the deal, moments away from being finalized, had begun to unravel not through confrontation, but through a single observation spoken by someone no one in the room had expected to matter. One of the senior executives finally broke the silence, his voice controlled but edged with impatience as he leaned forward and folded his hands neatly on the table, saying that the agreement had already gone through 3 rounds of legal review and that pausing now could risk the entire negotiation. His tone carried the subtle pressure of deadlines and expectations, the kind that moved markets and influenced board decisions. Whitmore did not answer immediately, he simply looked down at the contract again, then at the circled clause, and then back toward the executive, his expression calm but firm, and when he spoke his voice carried quiet authority, asking the legal team to confirm whether the opposing firm had disclosed this restructuring mechanism during final negotiations. The legal advisor hesitated briefly before explaining that the language was technically disclosed but embedded within performance contingencies, structured in a way that did not draw immediate attention unless specifically examined. That explanation settled heavily across the room. Another investor leaned forward, his brow tightening as he asked whether activating the clause would immediately dilute Whitmore's controlling shares. The advisor nodded slowly, explaining that within 18 months, failure to meet specific revenue benchmarks could trigger automatic equity redistribution, transferring operational authority to the incoming firm. the numbers hung in the air like invisible weight. Ava remained still, her hands resting lightly against the cleaning cart handle. Aware that the conversation had moved far beyond her presence yet still anchored to the observation she had made, Whitmore tapped the pen once more against the table, then set it aside, the sound soft but deliberate. Across the room several executives exchanged quiet glances, their earlier confidence fading into cautious calculation. One of them opened a laptop, quickly pulling up projections, while another scrolled through digital copies of the contract, verifying line references. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, asking the legal advisor to outline the worst-case scenario. The advisor cleared his throat and explained that if performance targets were missed, Whitmore's firm would lose majority voting power, 3 board seats would shift immediately, and strategic direction would transfer to the opposing firm, effectively turning the merger into a controlled acquisition. The explanation landed with quiet finality. The sunlight outside brightened again, casting long reflections across the table, and Ava noticed how the room felt smaller now, more concentrated. The weight of risk pressing inward. Whitmore's gaze moved slowly across the executives, reading their reactions, and then returned briefly to Ava, his expression thoughtful, as though recalculating how this moment had unfolded. The cleaner who had entered to collect papers now standing quietly beside a mop bucket while executives reconsidered a multimillion-dollar decision. One of the investors leaned back, exhaling slowly, saying that signing under those conditions would expose the company to unacceptable vulnerability. Another nodded, adding that the timeline alone created unnecessary pressure. Whitmore listened without interruption, his posture relaxed but attentive, and after a moment he reached forward and closed the contract gently, the soft sound of paper settling against the table echoing through the stillness, the decision to pause forming not through urgency but through careful restraint. And in that quiet moment, the momentum of the deal shifted further, the confidence that filled the room earlier replaced by caution, and Ava stood silently, aware that sometimes the most significant changes began not with loud confrontation, but with a single overlooked detail finally brought into the light. Whitmore's hand rested quietly on the closed contract as the room settled into a slower rhythm, the urgency replaced by careful thought, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the late afternoon light softened, turning the glass towers across the street into muted reflections, the city continuing its motion far below while the boardroom remained suspended in quiet reconsideration. Ava shifted her grip slightly on the cleaning cart, her fingers brushing against the cool metal handle, the faint scent of lemon cleaner still lingering in the air, unnoticed by most but grounding to her, a reminder of the role she had walked in with only minutes earlier. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but thoughtful, his gaze moving across the skyline as if measuring the weight of what had nearly happened. The executives spoke in lower voices now, their conversations careful and deliberate, one reviewing projections, another confirming clauses. The energy of the room no longer confident but reflective. Ava remained still, her presence quiet, not seeking attention, not expecting acknowledgement, simply waiting for the moment when she could return to her routine and continue down the hallway to the next conference room. The silence between decisions stretched gently, the hum of the ventilation system filling the space. Whitmore finally looked down again at the contract, his expression softened by contemplation rather than tension, and he tapped the edge of the document lightly with his fingertips, as though grounding himself in the present moment. Ava watched the movement without staring, aware that something subtle had shifted, not just in the deal, but in the way the room perceived her. She remembered her father's quiet lessons at the kitchen table, the sound of pencil against paper, the smell of coffee cooling beside stacks of numbers, the calm patience he carried even when things grew uncertain, and she felt that same calm now, steady and grounded. Whitmore's gaze moved once more toward Ava, not as an interruption, not as a challenge, but as quiet recognition, his eyes pausing for a second longer than before, acknowledging her presence without words. Ava lowered her eyes respectfully, her posture unchanged, the distance between them defined by position yet softened by understanding. One of the investors leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, remarking that pausing now might prevent a costly mistake later. Another nodded quietly, the tone of the room settling into cautious agreement. Whitmore did not speak immediately, he simply folded his hands together, considering the moment. The sunlight shifted again, casting warm reflections across the polished table and the contract resting at its center, and for a brief moment the boardroom felt less like a battlefield of negotiation and more like a place of reflection. Ava adjusted the wheels of her cart slightly, preparing to move, her shoes quiet against the marble floor. She had said what needed to be said, and now she returned to stillness, ready to fade back into the background, yet the air in the room carried a new awareness, a subtle respect that had not existed when she first entered, and as Whitmore looked once more at the contract and then toward the skyline, the quiet pause became something deeper, not just a delay in signing, but a moment of recognition, where authority met humility, and where a cleaner standing beside a mop bucket had changed the course of a decision simply by choosing to speak when silence would have been easier. Whitmore finally reached forward and slid the contract toward the legal advisor, his movement slow and deliberate, and when he spoke his voice carried a quiet finality that shifted the entire atmosphere of the room, instructing the team to halt the signing until a full risk review could be completed. The words landed softly but decisively, and several executives nodded almost immediately, relief and concern blending across their expressions. One investor leaned forward and asked how long the reassessment might take, and the legal advisor responded that a thorough analysis could be completed within 24 hours. Whitmore nodded once, his gaze steady, and then he leaned back slightly in his chair. The decision now settled, Ava gently turned her cleaning cart, preparing to move toward the door, her role finished, her presence once again meant to fade quietly into the background. The wheels of the cart rolled softly across the marble floor, barely audible beneath the hum of the ventilation system, and just as she reached the edge of the table Whitmore spoke again, his voice calm but directed, asking her to wait a moment. The room shifted subtly, several executives glanced toward her, surprised that he had addressed her directly. Ava paused, turning slightly, her hands resting lightly on the cart handle, her posture respectful and composed. Whitmore looked at her with measured curiosity, asking how she had noticed the clause so quickly. The question hung in the air. Not confrontational, but sincere. Ava hesitated briefly, then answered quietly, explaining that she used to read financial documents with her father, that he had worked in accounting and taught her to look for conditional transfers and performance triggers. Her voice remained calm, steady, without pride, simply stating a memory. Whitmore listened carefully, his expression thoughtful, and one of the executives leaned back slightly, studying her with new attention. Ava continued softly, explaining that the wording looked familiar, that she had seen similar structures before, and that something about the placement of the clause felt intentional. The room remained quiet as she finished. Whitmore nodded slowly, absorbing her explanation, and for a brief moment his gaze shifted toward the skyline again, as if weighing the significance of the moment. Outside, the sunlight reflected across neighboring towers, sending faint glimmers across the boardroom walls, and inside that room the distance between authority and humility felt smaller than before. Whitmore finally spoke again, thanking her in a simple, measured tone, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but sincere. Ava nodded slightly, her expression calm, and she turned the cart once more, moving toward the door, the quiet wheels rolling softly, and as she stepped into the hallway the sound of the boardroom faded behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of the building's quieter spaces. The fluorescent lights overhead casting soft reflections across the polished floor. Ava moved down the hallway, her steps calm, returning to the routine she knew. Yet inside the boardroom Whitmore remained still for a moment, his gaze lingering on the door she had just passed through, the contract resting unopened before him, and in that silence the realization settled deeper, that the most important warning of the day had come from someone who had not even been invited to the table. Ava pushed the cleaning cart slowly down the quiet hallway, the wheels rolling gently across the polished floor as the distant murmur of executive voices faded behind the closed boardroom doors. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft, even glow, reflecting faintly across the chrome edges of her cart, and she resumed her routine with steady familiarity, wiping the glass panels outside another conference room, her movements calm and practiced. Yet her thoughts lingered briefly on what had just happened, not with pride, not with expectation, but with the quiet awareness that she had simply done what felt right. A few minutes passed, the building settling back into its usual rhythm, footsteps echoing faintly in distant corridors, the low hum of elevators moving between floors, and then she heard quick but measured footsteps approaching from behind. She turned slightly as Whitmore stepped into the hallway, his presence composed but purposeful, his jacket still neatly pressed, his expression thoughtful rather than urgent. Ava straightened slightly, her hands resting on the cleaning cloth. Whitmore slowed as he reached her, the contrast between executive authority and her quiet workspace visible in the stillness between them. He spoke calmly, thanking her again, this time more personally, explaining that the legal team had already begun reviewing the clause more deeply and that initial findings suggested additional conditions embedded throughout the agreement. Ava listened quietly, nodding once, her expression calm, Whitmore continued, explaining that if they had signed immediately, the company might have faced significant operational limitations within months. His tone measured but sincere. Ava lowered her eyes respectfully, replying softly that she had only noticed something unusual, nothing more. Whitmore studied her for a moment, as though considering the weight of humility in her words. Then he asked how long she had worked in the building. Ava answered that she had been on the evening shift for nearly 8 months, working quietly across multiple floors. Whitmore nodded slowly, the realization settling in that she had been present all along, unnoticed, moving through the same corridors where major decisions unfolded daily. The sunlight from a nearby window stretched across the hallway floor, casting warm reflections between them. Whitmore then reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a small business card, explaining calmly that if she ever noticed anything unusual again, she should contact his office directly. Ava hesitated slightly before accepting it, her fingers brushing the smooth card stock, the printed name and number catching the light. She nodded softly, thanking him, her voice steady. Whitmore gave a small, respectful nod in return, then stepped back. His posture relaxed but thoughtful, and as he turned to walk back toward the boardroom, Ava returned to her work, wiping the glass panel gently, the cloth moving in slow circles, the building continuing around her in quiet motion. And as Whitmore disappeared down the hallway, the space settled again into calm routine. Yet something subtle had changed, not in the lights or the sound or the polished floors, but in the quiet recognition that sometimes the most important voices came from the people who moved through the building unnoticed, carrying no title, no authority, only the courage to speak when it mattered most. The evening light slowly shifted across the hallway as Ava continued her work, the warm glow from the western windows stretching long reflections across the polished floor, and the building gradually moved into its quieter rhythm, elevators chiming softly in the distance, conversations fading into low murmurs. She finished wiping the final glass panel and gently adjusted the supplies on her cart, her fingers brushing the business card Whitmore had handed her, still resting neatly in her pocket. She did not take it out, but she felt its presence there, small yet meaningful, like a quiet acknowledgement she had not expected. Inside the boardroom, the legal team continued reviewing the agreement, their voices calm but focused, numbers and conditions unfolding line by line. Whitmore stood near the window, his hands resting lightly in his pockets as he watched the skyline dim into early evening, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one, and the realization settled deeper that a decision worth hundreds of millions had shifted not because of negotiation strategy, but because someone outside the circle had chosen to speak. One of the legal advisors approached him quietly, explaining that additional clauses had been identified, each reinforcing the same transfer of control under layered conditions. Whitmore nodded slowly, absorbing the information, his expression thoughtful rather than tense. He looked once more toward the hallway beyond the glass doors, where Ava had returned to her routine, unseen by most, and then he turned back to the table, instructing the team to renegotiate the entire structure before moving forward. The decision landed calmly, met with quiet agreement, and as the meeting concluded, the executives gathered their documents with measured movements, the urgency of earlier replaced by careful resolve. Down the hallway Ava pushed her cart toward the service elevator, the wheels rolling softly. Her shift nearly finished, she paused briefly near a large window, looking out at the city as the last light faded into evening, the buildings glowing with scattered lights, traffic moving steadily below. She felt a quiet calm settle inside her, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because she had followed the simple instinct to speak when something felt wrong. The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime. She stepped inside, her reflection faint in the brushed steel walls. The doors closed softly, and the elevator began its slow descent. Above, Whitmore stepped out of the boardroom, the contract now resting under his arm, and as he walked past the hallway where Ava had stood earlier, he paused for a brief moment, noticing the faint scent of lemon cleaner still lingering in the air, a quiet reminder of the moment that had changed the course of the day. He continued walking, his steps measured, thoughtful, while below, the elevator reached the ground floor and Ava stepped out into the quieter lobby, the evening guard offering a small nod as she passed. She returned it with a gentle smile, then pushed her cart toward the exit, the glass doors opening automatically, the cool evening air greeting her softly. She stepped outside, the city lights reflecting across the pavement, and for a moment she paused, breathing in the calm of the evening. Then she continued forward, her footsteps steady, disappearing into the quiet rhythm of the night, while above, in an office filled with fading light, Whitmore placed the contract carefully on his desk, the unsigned pages resting still, and the silence that followed carry the quiet weight of a decision reshaped, not by authority, but by the courage of someone who had simply refused to remain invisible.